Hello there, folks. Today we are going to have a look at populist skepticism for the most part after the time of Tom Paine. And there are all kinds of interesting folks included in this. I've titled this talk Socialists, Secularists, and Reconverts, but even that doesn't cover the entire range. So hang on as we go through this. Just to keep you oriented, populist skepticism was largely an American and English phenomenon. It was originally deistic and later atheistic, characterized by coarseness of tone, little or no formal scholarship, sometimes pseudo-scholarship, directed at and popular among the working classes, but also sometimes on university campuses. We talked about Yale around the late 1790s last time, and it stretches across the 19th century. Let's have a look at some of the better known people in this. I can't even do them all, not even all the ones I wanted to do today, but you'll see why once we get started. There are a few recurring themes here. There's the question of the determination of the meaning of the biblical text, particularly figurative or prophetic language. There are questions of how to handle apparent discrepancies in narratives and in testimony, and there's the question of the value or lack of value of arguments from silence. Keep your eye on the ball with all of those. I'm going to move backward in time just a little bit to pick up Ethan Allen. He was a Revolutionary War hero, active in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga with the Green Mountain Boys. But he wrote a book of skeptical, deistic writing called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. Published it in 1785. It may have been influenced by Charles Blount's book, The Oracles of Reason. The title is certainly similar. There is an influence of Spinoza that shows up on both of these writers. There's a possible pattern match there. You can check that out further if you're interested. The book sold poorly. It's actually a bit of a minor historical miracle that we still have copies. It sold around 200 copies, and the rest were languishing in the printer's lodgings when a fire swept through and they were all destroyed. But we do have some copies, and they're interesting just to look at as a window into a certain kind of deist in the United States around the time of the American Revolution. Here's his argument against miracles. He says, look, if you want to say that there's a God and that miracles have occurred, then you're going to be forced into one of two syllogisms here. The laws of nature were in their eternal establishment perfect. The laws of nature have been altered. Therefore, the alteration of the laws of nature is imperfect. Or, the laws of nature have been altered. The alteration has been for the better. Therefore, the eternal establishment thereof was imperfect. Thus it appears, says Allen, from a syllogistical as well as other methods of reasoning, that provided we admit of miracles which are synonymous to the alterations of nature, we, by so doing, derogate from the perfection of God, either in his eternal constitution of nature, or in a supposed subsequent miraculous alteration of it, so that, take the argument either way, and it preponderates against miracles. Now, if you've been with us through last year's course as well, you'll remember that Spinoza made this same argument in his Tractatus. It's beneath the dignity of a deity to alter the laws of nature. They are his perfect will. How can God alter his own will? Peter Annett had brought up the same line of argument. Voltaire, we saw in an earlier lecture this summer, takes up the same line of argument. So this is a very common line of argument, so common that it's difficult to say just from the fact of his using it where he might have picked it up. Allen also takes a couple of swipes at prophecy. Here's how he goes after them. The writings of the prophets, he says, are most generally so loose, vague, and indeterminate in their meaning or in the grammar of their present translation, that the prophecies will as well answer to events in one period of time as in another, and are equally applicable to a variety of events which have and are still taking place in the world, and are liable to so many different interpretations that they are incapable of being understood or explained, except upon arbitrary principles, and therefore cannot be admitted as a proof of revelation, as, for instance, and then he quotes this phrase, "It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God." Well, what's that supposed to mean? It shall come to pass in the last days. The last days, when are they? Well, every day is the last day in the series of all of the days up to that time. So at any time that anything like this shall come to pass, it can be cited as a fulfillment of the prophecy. That's so vague as to be utterly useless. Again, he quotes from Daniel 12. There's an exchange. When shall be the end of these wonders? And the answer comes, he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever, that it shall tarry for a time, 2 times, and a half. Well, Allen goes to town on this one. A time, he says, is an indefinite part of duration, and so are times, and the third description of time is as indefinite as either of the former descriptions of it. There is no certain term given in any or either of the 3 descriptions of the end of the wonders alluded to, whereby any or all of them put together are capable of computation, as there is no certain period marked out to begin or end a calculation. So this is uttered with all the solemnity of a vow to heaven, but it's completely worthless. It sounds like it's communicating something, but it's not. Of course, Allen is taking the standpoint that the purpose of the prophecy was to enable us to predict the date of its fulfillment, not a position I think that many other readers of the book of Daniel would have taken. So this is something, very often prophecy is not predictive. It's a foretelling of the Word of God, not a foretelling of events. And when it is a foretelling of events, almost invariably the purpose is not to permit the initial hearer to calculate the time, but rather to permit those who see it fulfilled to go back and read and recognize that it was a fulfillment. There are some difficulties attendant upon that, but these are things that had been discussed very fully by people like Sherlock in his book The Use and Intent of Prophecy, by Joseph Butler in The Analogy of Religion, and by many other authors, Edward Chandler in his Defense of Christianity, and so forth. So well before Allen's time, these issues had been discussed very seriously. But it's characteristic of populist skepticism that it does not address itself to the serious work that's been done before. Almost never quotes it, almost never engages with it. That's just not the style and speed of this kind of skeptic. As a counterweight on the American side, David Nelson, also someone who participated in an American war, but in this case it was in 1812, he was a physician, an abolitionist, and later in life a Presbyterian minister, but he was not always so. In his youth, he fell among company who had imbibed the infidelity of Paine and Voltaire. There was a tavern that he would frequent with his buddies in the army, and this was the kind of talk that went round, and he picked it up pretty easily, it just being there in the atmosphere. But sometime around 1823, he came back to Christianity, and then with a glimmer in his eye as a doctor, wrote a book called The Cause and Cure of Infidelity, which he published in 1841. It is not itself a work on the evidences of Christianity. It has some pieces of evidence put forward through it, and they are pieces of the time. The scholarship is the scholarship of the time, sometimes sound, sometimes needing updating. But what's really interesting is that Nelson gives us an insider's view of what it was like to fall into that kind of company, what their talk was like, what things they were citing, and what they didn't know. So he starts out in the preface with a comment about the gap between works on the Christian evidences that you can find in the libraries of ministers and the sort of skepticism he was encountering out among the people. Those authors of works on the evidences of Christianity aim, he said, at cavils the most plausible only, and strike at infidel objections most worthy of answer, whereas the youth thus injured are very often influenced by arguments puerile in the extreme, and so feeble that better informed would never believe they could be used. So he wants to write a book to people who are in the grip of, or know people in the grip of, this kind of lowbrow skepticism. And he's warning them that although he will recommend the reading of books on the evidences of Christianity, some of the objections are so foolish that they're not even going to come up, they're not going to be treated in those treatises, and that's a problem. He talks about the use of notes and commentaries on the Bible. He eventually obtained a commentary on the Bible, Scott's commentary, which was circulating in Kentucky in the 1820s. But he notes that he had been dissuaded for a long time from reading any commentaries. And here's how he puts it. I must notice the sophism which was used to keep me from reading it, and which is still urged by many of Satan's able assistants in many parts of the world to keep others from reading commentaries on the Bible. Read for yourself, they exclaim. Judge for yourself. Do not permit others to impose their belief upon you. And then he goes on to give a diagnosis. The truthful and therefore imposing part is that we should never copy the thoughts of others with neutral servility, so as to let others judge for us. The erroneous part consists in this, that it seems to teach as though we could not avail ourselves of the labors of others without adopting their judgment. If someone has read works of history you have not, and can point you to parallels between what you are reading in Scripture and what you can read in these other works of history, it would be foolish to refuse their aid and to refuse to look at those other works simply because they hold opinions that you do not hold. They may hold opinions you don't hold, but you can still make use of their labors. You can still make use of their learning. Nelson's recommended cure, he actually advocates two cures. There's one that is powerful and there's another that is all-powerful. And speaking again like a physician, he says that he's going to devote most of his time and talk first about the powerful cure, which will work in most cases, though not in quite all. And at the end, he'll talk about the all-powerful cure, which has the advantage that it infallibly works and the disadvantage that it's almost impossible to get people to use it. The all-powerful cure, which it's very difficult to get someone who's steeped in infidelity to use, is sincere, earnest fasting and prayer. If they would do it, it would work. And he gives examples that lie within his knowledge of such cases, not only of people who are openly disbelieving, but people who are in serious doubt. But he says the further they are into doubt, the less likely it is that they will engage in serious fasting and prayer. And so the best of all possible cures is one they simply won't take. And he said, as a physician, I've come to realize that there are times when you tell someone what he needs to do to get better and he won't do it. So here's one that more people will try and that almost always works. Read seriously and earnestly, and read multiple books on the evidences of Christianity. He names a few: Alexander's Evidences, Paley's Evidences, Watson's Answer to Paine. There's a set of letters to Voltaire published by some Jews in England because of Voltaire's attacks on their scriptures, the Old Testament. Thomas Hartwell Horne's Introduction to the Critical Study and Knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, just the first volume, he says, will do, and George Stanley Faber's Difficulties of Infidelity. He recommends reading these books not in any particular designated order, and there is some overlap among them, but he says you'll find that eventually, somewhere or other, most of the serious difficulties that lie before your mind will be covered. And since he can't predict where those will be, you just have to take the time and read around. And he gives some case histories where he brought 5 or 6 of these to some people. There was one interesting case of a young man who had imbibed skeptical doubts, and he recommended this to him, and he took him all of the books listed above. And at the end of it, the young man said to him very gravely, I'm in a really perplexing state of mind. Every one of my objections has been answered in the reading of the books that you have given, and yet I find that I cannot believe that Christianity is true. So that's one of the instances where it brought the young man to the point where his intellectual doubts were satisfied, but he had other doubts still remaining that were not of an intellectual kind. Here's his own statement again about using either kind of cure. It is known to the world of physicians that the treatment of those diseases wherein the sick deem themselves entirely whole is attended with unusual difficulties because they are not willing to use the remedy. Unbelievers usually think themselves well informed, particularly those whose minds are well stored with other knowledge, when the opposite fact is the truth. And then he instances some of this from his own experience. talking about a period of time when he was still a skeptic, but coming to worry that maybe skepticism was false. And he says, reading Volney's Ruins of Empires and reading Paine's Age of Reason actually moved him back towards Christianity. But here's what he says: that which gave me most pain was that which I met so frequently and which occurred almost hourly from day to day. I saw those who assumed the lordly look as soon as the subject was mentioned. They put on the consequential air of high authority, and with the tone of emphatic decision, they pronounced others more than idiots, while at the same time it was evident that they did not know Alexander the Great from Alexander the Coppersmith. It was true of the most positive and the most overbearing in this controversy that they were unacquainted with all ancient history, and would not know Peter the Apostle from Peter the Hermit had you seriously tested the matter by particular examination. That those who had never read 100 volumes of anything should so confidently and so repeatedly sneer at the learned and the grey-headed and the meek who had been toiling in a 50 years' research began to make me suspect that men hated Christianity with a spontaneous and a special dislike. I did not hear the ploughman deciding with oaths, sarcasm, and vehemence in matters of navigation, wherein he was totally ignorant. I did not hear the apprentice boy pronouncing all who did not hold his theory of astronomy deluded or hypocritical. I doubted whether in anything, religion excepted, men would so generally decide so quickly and so haughtily while they were uninformed. Robert Owen is the next figure I'd like to talk about. He's quite a curious fellow, a Welsh socialist and utopian. He was preceded by Saint-Simon, followed by utopians like Thoreau, but he actually set up several model communities. They all failed. The most notable one, he came over to America and got some land on the bank of the Wabash River and set up New Harmony, which ended catastrophically. There were a few good-hearted, hard-working people there, but there were also a lot of people who were lazy or aggressive or just there to make a buck off of the chumps who were running the socialist community. And so the whole thing ended as a debacle. And in the end, he said, "Everyone's a little queer except me and thee," he said to his partner in it, "and even thou art a bit queer." So the whole thing collapsed. What lay behind Owen's theory of utopia was his theory of human nature and its formation. He held that there is no fixed human nature. What we become solely in virtue of the environments to which we are subjected. So you can see here the influence of some thinkers in the vein of Rousseau's Émile, right? Let's raise you completely free from all these cluttering influences. And the idea is that if we do that, why, people will be happy and charitable and benevolent and everything will work perfectly well. They worked better for some people than for others, and eventually not well for anyone. A year after, the spring after, the failure of New Harmony, Owen was still here in the United States, and he engaged in a public debate with Alexander Campbell on the subject of the evidences of Christianity, but also on the utopian theories of Owen himself. Here are some examples from Owen. Here's what he says about the uncertainty of historical knowledge. Note what a useful skeptical trope this is. "I believe a certain number of the prominent and leading facts of all histories which seem to be generally attested, and upon what is deemed the best authority that can be obtained, when not opposed by the divine laws of human nature. But I do not believe much of the details of either profane or sacred history," so widespread skepticism about history. "I know how difficult it is for individuals to go away from this meeting and relate facts precisely as they occurred here. Then what degree of faith can we have in narratives put upon record many years after the facts which they relate, and said to have happened, and every conceivable opportunity and motive to falsify them? I know of nothing more fallacious in its nature than history, sacred or profane. And when opposed to the known laws of nature, their testimony, however testified, is of no value whatever." Curiously, That's from the debate with Campbell, the 1729 debate that was published 10 years later. Curiously, Owen does not name David Hume here, but Campbell knew full well where he was getting this, and so that's going to come up in Campbell's rejoinder. But we see, of course, this kind of deprecatory attitude toward history among the new atheists today. Many of them take a very skeptical view of most of history and are quite willing to abandon large chunks of it if it seems that in consistency they would have to give up some of their preferred positions if they admitted that we have wide and deep historical knowledge. Owen's opponent was Alexander Campbell. He was a Scots-Irish immigrant and clergyman, came over to the United States to join his father in the ministry here. He was the co-founder of the Restoration movement in America during the Second Great Awakening. Sometimes the Stone Campbell movement is another name for that, sometimes called that. He engaged in public debates with several skeptics, and these were both oral and written, and most notably the debate with Owen in 1829. What's really interesting when you contrast Owen and Campbell is that where Owen cites few sources and it generally puts forward his ideas as his own, Campbell is clearly influenced by much of the literature that's gone before. So I am going to give you here just a list of 5 people whom he cites and the page references in the debate with Owen so that you can go back and see some of this influence on him. So Leslie's Short and Easy Method with the Deists, Sherlock's Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, Lardner's Credibility of the Gospel History, Campbell's Dissertation on Miracles is his go-to source. No relation to George Campbell that I know of, but he clearly is heavily influenced by George Campbell. And finally, William Paley's View of the Evidences of Christianity. So you can find citations of all of these works, express citations, or of the authors at any rate, and we can figure out which works from the nature of the citations in Campbell's debate with Owen. He has other works as well. We'll have them all in the database eventually, all that pertain to what we're talking about here, but these are particular places in this one work that you can see connections between the deist controversy literature and Campbell's debate. Here's what Campbell has to say on Hume's argument against miracles. Remember, this is Alexander Campbell, but the line of argument is, and he admits is, coming from George Campbell. To detect the sophistry of Hume, he writes, we must give a true definition of experience. Experience is either personal or derived. He goes on and he gives a definition of personal experience and of derived experience. Then he says, our opponents, by the term experience, must mean personal experience unless they make use of the sophism called by logicians a circle in causes. For derived experience is derived from testimony and cannot be contrasted with it. And a little later, now, if all testimony is to be judged by our personal experience or by our memory or senses, we shall be reduced in the measure of our information even below the savage himself. So we must allow that our experience includes experience that is derived from the testimony of others. But once we do that, we cannot turn around and make that an argument to cut off the force of evidence of the testimony of others. After all, that truly is sawing off the branch on which one is sitting. There's a lot more in Campbell that you can go and explore for yourself. I just want to touch on a couple of other figures, though. And again, I'm sorry that I can't hit them all, but here are a few of the prominent ones. George Holyoake, British secularist. He actually coined the term secularism in 1851. As soon as Huxley came out with the word agnostic, he applied it to himself, although he was an agnostic inclined to atheism. He was the last person to be convicted of blasphemy in England. In 1842, he gave a public lecture. Nothing in the text of the lecture could be pressed against him for blasphemy, but somebody asked him a question, and he gave a verbal answer to the question. The verbal answer was written down by others in the audience, and it was on the strength of that that he was tried and convicted of blasphemy. He was the owner of several newspapers. He edited The Reasoner from 1846 to 1861. He was active in the National Secular Society, but in 1877, he had a break with Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, so he let them go their way. At that point, he founded the British Secular Union. That was active until 1884. Interestingly, he was influenced as a young man of about 18 by the socialist writings of Robert Owen. So there are connections backward here to people earlier in history, and we'll be seeing personal connections like that as we go along. Holyoake wrote voluminously. I have not had the time to go through and cull a great deal of what he wrote, but there will be some examples that we'll have up in the database for you so that you can go hunting if you want to see specimens of his approach. He was an accomplished public speaker and very much moved by the new sciences and desirous of applying a scientific method to as many problems as possible. And now we come to someone who's actually extremely important for understanding the history of secularism in the Victorian era, and that's Charles Bradlaugh, whose life very nearly spanned the Victorian era. He was a lawyer, a member of Parliament. There was a great brouhaha about his taking the oath to be seated as a member of Parliament. He was actually taken to jail when he tried to take his oath. There's a huge controversy over that. Undoubtedly the most prominent secularist of the 19th century. Outspoken, not a gentleman. When he was a young man, he raised some questions about the compatibility of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer with the Bible. His vicar, after wrangling with the young man for a little while, denounced him as an atheist. His family threw him out of the family home. And he was taken in by Richard Carlisle's widow, Eliza Sharples Carlisle. You may remember that Carlisle is the one who went to jail for publishing, among other things, Paine's Age of Reason, and was very active. So his wife was also a secularist, but she took in the young Bradlaugh, gave him a house, and he made his way in the world, no doubt, permanently embittered by the ill treatment that he had received. That's a recurring theme in many of these cases. Someone will be treated badly, and the reaction will be that he loses his faith. I'm not trying to say that that carries any force as a reason. He has his reasons, he'll give you his reasons, but as a causal factor, it does seem to be quite common. For quite some time, he spoke and debated under the name iconoclast, partly, I think, to preserve his own career, which was advancing until the point where he was actually elected as a member of Parliament. So, on the covers of some of the books that contain records of his debates, you'll see him referred to simply as iconoclast. Here's an example of Bradlaugh's style. He took this proposition as one for which he would maintain the affirmative in a discussion he had with Brewin Grant in 1858. The God of the Bible, revengeful, inconstant, unmerciful, and unjust. His attributes proven to be contradicted by the book which is professed to reveal them. Rephrased so as not to be a proposition for debate, but an actual pair of descriptive sentences. This would not seem at all out of place coming from the pen of Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. This is right in line with the kind of skepticism they propose. Final one for today. I said reconverts, and Joseph Barker is a really interesting case of that. Not the only one we'll look at in this course, but a very interesting one. He was, at various times, a Methodist minister, a secularist lecturer, and a Christian apologist. In fact, he went from Methodist to Quaker, to Unitarian, to atheist, and then back to Unitarian, and then, at the end of his life, ranged himself with the Primitive Methodists. He wrote a book. I don't have a picture of him, but I do have a copy of the title page of his final book, published a year before his death. Modern Skepticism, A Journey Through the Land of Doubt and Back Again, a life story by Joseph Barker. Barker started his career in England among the Methodists. He was a preacher and, in fact, an apologist, and wrote a book defending Christianity in the, I believe, 1840s, and giving his reasons for it. But gradually, he slipped into deeper and deeper skeptical thoughts and eventually became a well-known lecturer for the British secularists. When he reconverted in the 60s, he devoted the last 10 years of his life to writing in defense of Christianity. It's quite curious that Bradlaugh wrote a book about the most conspicuous of the free thinkers, and the final chapter of the book is devoted to Joseph Barker. Here's how it opens. In any work purporting to be a true record of free thinkers, the name of Joseph Barker cannot be omitted. We find him from the commencement of his public life till the present time an ardent desire for and a determination to achieve freedom of thought and expression on all subjects appertaining to theology, politics, and sociology. Possessing a vigorous intellect, a constitution naturally strong, great oratorical ability, and an unrivaled command of the Saxon language, he has made himself a power among each party with whom the transitory state of his mind has brought him in contact. It is seldom we find men with equal boldness, when once connected with Wesleyan Methodism, rising, superior in thought, to its narrow, selfish, dogmatic, unnatural, and humiliating views, and claiming for human nature a more dignified and exalted position, gradually advancing to Unitarianism, ultimately to land safely on the shore of materialism. Joseph Barker has passed amid persecution and privation through these different phases of theology to arrive at infidelity. To be, he states, a better, wiser, and happier man. Curiously, one of the things that Barker did when he was still in England was to engage in some debates with people who had been his colleagues and had left the secularist movement. And one of the complaints that he muses about and others would always bring forward in such cases was, well, is he losing it? Has he just lost his reason? Has he sunk to a state of intellectual feebleness where he's no longer able really to command the powers of an active mind? Some of you may remember a decade or so ago when Antony Flew declared that he was no longer an atheist and believed that there was a God. Flew came to a kind of deism. It was very common among contemporary atheists to say, he's going senile. That's the problem. And Flew was quite indignant about this and thought that it was a really poor excuse for an argument. But it's a very common one, and it's an old one. And as we look over the history of these things, you'll find that what Barker said of others and what Holyoake said of others is the common response to someone who's been in a society that vaunts itself as having arrived at the rational, the reasonable position, and then leaves that society and goes to the very thing that they are devoted to criticizing. Perhaps he was conscious that that was going to be the charge leveled against him, and so a few weeks before his death, he summoned several witnesses and had them sign as witnesses to the following statement, which was then published in a Methodist Connection publication and then quoted in Timothy Larson's book, Crisis of Doubt. I feel that I am approaching my end and desire that you should receive my last words and be witnesses to them. I wish you to witness that I am in my right mind and fully understand what I have just been doing, and, dying, that I die in the firm and full belief in Jesus Christ and in the faith and love of his religion as revealed in his life and works, as described in the New Testament, that I have an abiding faith in and love of God as God is revealed to us by his Son, Jesus Christ, and I die trusting in God's infinite love and mercy and in full faith of a future and better life. I am sorry for my past errors, but during the last years of my life I have striven to undo the harm I did by doing all I was able to serve God, by showing the beauty and wisdom of the religion of his Son, Jesus Christ. I wish you to write down and witness this, my last confession of faith, that there may be no doubt about it. A few weeks later, he passed away, and this is the final testament he left of his ultimate intellectual position. I've mentioned Timothy Larson's book, Crisis of Doubt, before, about honest faith in the 19th century. Barker is one of the 7 reconverts whose history Larson traces. If you have any interest in that, if that might be a topic you would be interested in writing a paper on, I urge you to get a copy of Larson's book. You will not regret having spent the money for it. Pull it out of a library if you can't afford to get a copy of it physically, but that is a remarkably fascinating work that shows a whole new side to religious controversy and the struggles regarding faith and reason in Victorian England.